Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member, Catherine Delahunty. Tēnā koe, Ms Delahunty.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, tēnā koutou te whare paramata. I'd like to start by acknowledging the promoter of the bill, Te Ororoa Flavel, tēnā koe Te Ororoa, because every time that somebody brings something before the House like this, it's an opportunity for others, and it's quite a lot of complex mahi has gone into many of the bills, including this one, and it's great to have got to this point, and I acknowledge the other speakers so far because I think it's an important kōrero that is very interesting. And I also want to acknowledge Ngāti Tapu, Ngāti Tama, Te Mara Waho and Ngāi Tūkairangi, because all of these hapu have had strong interest in the Te Papa lands through Mai Rā Nō. I'd like to acknowledge the Select Committee. I only sat on the Select Committee for brief periods of time. I didn't get to go to Tauranga Moana, which I would have loved to have done to her the kōrero firsthand, but I want to acknowledge the Select Committee because I felt there was a lot of really genuine commitment there to try and resolve the issues and to go back to the people of Tauranga Moana who are associated with this bill and find solutions. And the Select Committee was not trying to tell them what the solution was. The Select Committee was trying to whakamana them, if you like, to make their own, and that's never simple. And in some ways it's particularly complex because we're using parliamentary instruments through law and Select Committee, etc., to attempt to resolve hapu issues which are about whakapapa and ahika and relationships with land, using instruments that are not really designed for that purpose. There were and are traditional ways of resolving these things, but at some point something had to be done, and so the Māori Affairs Select Committee has done something with their best intentions and with their best abilities. As others have said, we're in the context of the 150th anniversary of Pokahenahana, the Battle of Gate Pa, and the raupatu of Tauranga Moana, and it's very interesting to think about those times and to think that we hope to do differently, as Jonathan Young has just said. And in order to do that, I think we really need to be honest about the driving forces of history here, and we have to recognise that the evangelisation of the heathens, which was the driving force of the CMS, the missionaries, was essentially from the context of the individuals. It may well have been conducted with deep conviction and goodwill from their perspective, but in the end it was a paternalistic and colonial mindset that did harm. And what's interesting about the Church Missionary Society is how much land they got out of it. So all rhetoric aside, the Church has done bloody well out of colonisation, and in actual fact they haven't been that keen to give it back. And it's been quite a noticeable struggle with a number of the churches that they've acquired wealth, power, buildings and status at the expense of tangata whenua, and it's only through these challenges that some of them have been forced to look in the mirror at their own behaviour. And I enjoyed hearing about Alfred Brown and his conflicted, contradictory, emotional landscape. But, you know, what I feel about it is, and with the hindsight of history, is this was paternalistic. This was fundamentally racist because there was no respect for what I believe is the Article 4 Te Treaty of Waitangi, which is the principle of ritenga. And so it depends whether you acknowledge Te Tiriti or Waitangi or whether you're talking about the treaty. And that comes up in many bills, but is equally true in the Otamataha bill, because actually by 1852, the articles, not the principles that were invented by lawyers since, but the articles of Te Tiriti were beginning to be undermined through a series of acts, raupatu and legislation from 1852 on that undermined the goodwill that was present in that short and more cooperative era after 1840. So it's definitely important for us to understand this and to recognise that this bill does take small but positive steps, and each one of these moments is important. Maybe it's a series of bills before this House, but in the end, for the people of the mana whenua, this is very important that we do this right, and in doing this right, that we acknowledge the actual history of marginalisation and raupatu that is represented here. And although the Church didn't give the land to the military for settlers to develop, the Church kept it for themselves. And the church argued that they were doing this to protect the interests of the so-called natives, but in fact they protected their own interests. And when the chips were down, Alfred Brown sided with his own people, understandably, and he sided with them to the detriment of the people he said he was there to make a total lifelong commitment to stand alongside. And that's the difference between power with and power over, because actually what took place in Tauranga Moana was a crude exercising of dominance. And it's great now that finally, in 2014, we've got to the point where there's been a renegotiation of what happened in terms of the Otamataha mission, because it was a mission, all right, but it wasn't a mission that actually benefited the tangata whenua or the mana whenua. I think you've always got to ask the question, or one always has to ask the question, who has benefited from these processes? And clearly the churches have benefited, clearly the settlers have benefited, but again, we were in a difficult place discussing this because conflicting hapu claims are outside many of our realm of understanding and experience. Not for Māori members of Parliament, but for those of us who are not, it's quite difficult to know how to act with authenticity, integrity and good faith around issues that are beyond our understanding. And yet that's sometimes what these bills require, that we take decisions about who's going to get what. And again, that does raise for me the issue of the contemporary context being as equally fraught as it was in 1852. Now, we're still in a very fraught era, Mr. Speaker, and that era requires us to have more than just new legislation but new education. And it is interesting that the constitutional conversation that has taken place in this country in the last couple of years talks about te tiriti of education, because clearly I think it's obvious that we don't have a robust te tiriti education system. We don't have many people understanding the principle of contra preferendum, which is the principle whereby the only treaty that should be accepted as the fundamental one is the one that was signed at Waitangi in Te Reo Māori. That's what the international principle of contra preferendum means. It means the indigenous version as understood by the indigenous people is the legal te tiriti. And if you acknowledge that, then it's pretty clear that the Church Missionary Society and others were not in the spirit of te tiriti. So it's good that we stand here today and that the member has brought this bill through the House and that the Select Committee worked so positively with it. We welcome this bill, but we do remind everybody that if we're going to talk about te tiriti o Waitangi, the articles, let's go back to what international law and tangata whenua know, particularly those who've read the book Ngā Puhi Speaks, which outlines that tangata whenua have been trying to deal with the culture of immigration and settler issues since 1808. They've been having kōrero about that actually we need to hold true te tiriti o Waitangi to the articles of the treaty and to acknowledging the painful and difficult history that took place at Otamataha and many other places. We recognise that the church didn't develop the land in the same way, in the sense that it didn't become private property, and the huge issue we have with many of the treaty settlements is so little land is available because of private property, which has been a very good strategy since the 1850s to bring in private property and prevent people from being able to get their land back. But we really need to acknowledge that the churches need to be more generous and more responsible for what they've done. They've made a lot of money out of Māori land. It's time to recognise that this country is not a huge continent. It's a small country. Every inch has a story. Every maunga, every awa, every piece of whenua has a history, and we need the courage to work through issues of justice as we're trying to do today. Kia ora tātou katoa.
I call the Honourable Member Rino Terakatini. Tēnā koe, Mr Terakatini.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā